he exalted. For instance, you take the uncompleted books of living authors, fresh from their hands, wet from the press, cut, hack, and carve them to the powers and capacities of your actors, and the capability of your theatres, finish unfinished works, hastily and crudely vamp up ideas not yet worked out by their original projector, but which have doubtless cost him many thoughtful days and sleepless nights, by a comparison of incidents and dialogue, down to the very last word he may have written a fortnight before, do your utmost to anticipate his plot, all this without his permission, and against his will, and then, to crown the whole proceeding, publish in some mean pamphlet an unmeaning farrago of garbled extracts from his work, to which your name as author, with the honourable distinction annexed, of having perpetrated 100 other outrages of the same description. Now show me the distinction between such pilfering as this, and picking a man's pocket in the street, unless indeed it be that the legislature has a regard for pocket handkerchiefs, and leaves men's brains, except when they are knocked out by violence, to take care of themselves. Men must live, sir, said the literary gentleman, shrugging his shoulders. That would be an equally fair plea in both cases, replied Nicholas. But if you put it upon that ground, I have nothing more to say than that if I were a writer of books, and you a thirsty dramatist, I would rather pay your tavern score for 6 months, large as it might be, than have a niche in the temple of fame with you for the humblest corner of my pedestal through 600 generations. The conversation threatened to take a somewhat angry tone when it had arrived thus far, but Mrs. Crummles opportunely interposed to prevent it leading to any violent outbreak, by making some inquiries of the literary gentleman relative to the plots of the 6 new pieces which he had written by contract to introduce the African knife swallower in his various unrivalled performances. This speedily engaged him in an animated conversation with that lady, in the interest of which all recollection of his recent discussion with Nicholas very quickly evaporated. The board now being clear of the more substantial articles of food, and punch, wine, and spirits being placed upon it and handed about, the guests, who had been previously conversing in little groups of 3 or 4, gradually fell off into a dead silence, while the majority of those present glanced from time to time at Mr. Snittle Timberry, and the bolder spirits did not even hesitate to strike the table with their knuckles, and plainly intimate their expectations by uttering such encouragements as, "Now, Tim!" "Wake up, Mr. Chairman!" "All charged, sir, and waiting for a toast," and so forth. To these remonstrances, Mr. Timberry designed no other rejoinder than striking his chest and gasping for breath, and giving many other indications of being still the victim of indisposition, for a man must not make himself too cheap, either on the stage or off, while Mr. Crummles, who knew full well that he would be the subject of the forthcoming toast, sat gracefully in his chair with his arm thrown carelessly over the back, and now and then lifted his glass to his mouth and drank a little punch, with the same air with which he was accustomed to take long draughts of nothing out of the pasteboard goblets in banquet scenes. At length, Mr. Snittle Timberry rose in the most approved attitude, with one hand in the breast of his waistcoat, and the other on the nearest snuff-box, and having been received with great enthusiasm, proposed, with abundance of quotations, his friend Mr. Vincent Crummles, ending a pretty long speech by extending his right hand on one side and his left hand on the other, and severally calling upon Mr. and Mrs. Crummles to grasp the same. This done, Mr. Vincent Crummles returned thanks, and that done, the African Swallower proposed Mrs. Vincent Crummles in affecting terms. Then were heard loud moans and sobs from Mrs. Crummles and the ladies, despite of which that heroic woman insisted upon returning thanks herself, which she did, in a manner and in a speech which has never been surpassed and seldom equalled. It then became the duty of Mr. Snittle Timberry to give the young Crummleses, which he did, after which Mr. Vincent Crummles, as their father, addressed the company in a supplementary speech, enlarging on their virtues, amiabilities, and excellences, and wishing that they were the sons and daughter of every lady and gentleman present. These solemnities having been succeeded by a decent interval, enlivened by musical and other entertainments, Mr. Crummles proposed that ornament of the profession, the African Swallower, his very dear friend, if he would allow him to call him so, which liberty, there being no particular reason why he should not allow it, the African Swallower graciously permitted. The literary gentleman was then about to be drunk, but it being discovered that he had been drunk for some time in another acceptation of the term, and was then asleep on the stairs, the intention was abandoned, and the honour transferred to the ladies. Finally, after a very long sitting, Mr. Snittle Timberry vacated the chair, and the company, with many adieux and embraces, dispersed. Nicholas waited to the last to give his little presents. When he had said good-bye all round, and came to Mr. Crummles, he could not but mark the difference between their present separation and their parting at Portsmouth. Not a jot of his theatrical manner remained. He put out his hand with an air which, if he could have summoned it at will, would have made him the best actor of his day in homely parts, and when Nicholas shook it with the warmth he honestly felt, appeared thoroughly melted. "We were a very happy little company, Johnson," said poor Crummles. "You and I never had a word. I shall be very glad tomorrow morning to think that I saw you again, but now I almost wish you hadn't come." Nicholas was about to return a cheerful reply, when he was greatly disconcerted by the sudden apparition of Mrs. Grudden, who it seemed had declined to attend to the supper in order that she might rise earlier in the morning, and who now burst out of an adjoining bedroom, habited in very extraordinary white robes, and throwing her arms about his neck, hugged him with great affection. "What! Are you going too?" said Nicholas, submitting with as good a grace as if she had been the finest young creature in the world. "Going!" returned Mrs. Grudden. "Lord ha' mercy! What do you think they'd do without me?" Nicholas submitted to another hug with even a better grace than before, if that were possible, and waving his hat as cheerfully as he could, took farewell of the Vincent Crummleses. End of chapter 48. Recorded by Megan Manley on January 20th, 2009, in Punta Gorda, Belize.